Let's start with the person we all need to hear from. Just 4 days after her budget, a little earlier today, I spoke to the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. Chancellor, can we start where we left off last year? Let's remind ourselves of what you said to me 12 months ago.
We've now wiped the slate clean under the mismanagement and the chaos of the previous government. It's now on us. We've put everything out into the open.
Okay.
We've set the spending envelope for the course of this Parliament. We don't need to come back for more. We've done that now. We've wiped the slate clean. Yeah, look, I'm not going to be able to write 5 years' worth of budgets on this show today, but what we have
I'm just
done,
saying,
there's
will
no
there
need.
be more tax rises?
No, you're right, Trevor. There is no need to come back with another budget like this. We never need to do that again. We've now, Trevor, set the spending envelope for the remainder of this Parliament. We don't need to increase taxes further. We need to do two things now. We need to reform our public services to make sure they work better, and we need to grow our economy.
That wasn't true, was it?
Well, the budget this year was not on the scale of the one last year, but as I set out in my speech at the beginning of November, the context for this budget did change, and I did have to ask people to contribute more. And the biggest thing that happened between the spring forecast and the forecast that the Office of Budget Responsibility provided for this budget was a big downgrade in productivity. Now, the OBR have been really clear. That reflects the legacy of the previous 14 years, not anything that this government has done in the last 16 months. But nevertheless, that productivity downgrade means that they forecast tax receipts are going to be £16 billion lower, which is why I gave a speech at the beginning of November saying that the OBR downgrade has had big impact on the public finances, and it was why I would need to ask people to contribute more.
Well, let's unpack that. We'll come to the speech at the beginning of November and the OBR in a second.
Yeah.
But let's just deal with the simple fact that what you said last year turned out not to be true. The scale of the tax rises this year is not far off. Last year it was 40 billion. This year it's 26 billion. Literally, it just wasn't true. And, you know, it's not a fault, but I think we should just make sure that we start on the same footing, that what you thought you were going to be able to do turned out not to be the case.
I think that is true, but for reasons on this, not in my control. The Office of Budget Responsibility rightly provides independent forecasts. Now, you know, it's up to them to justify the timing of the productivity review. They are very clear the productivity reflects the last 2 years.
Because I want to come to that. But you've just said it because of things that were not in your control. But literally in that clip, you said, this is now on us.
Yes.
You said 12 months ago, everything that happens from now is my choice. It is on us.
Well, look, the Office of Budget Responsibility, you're not interviewing them, you're interviewing me, but they decided
to do a review.
Them. Well, they decided to do a review of productivity. That is the Conservative legacy. The Office of Budget Responsibility are really clear that productivity downgrade does not reflect anything that this government has done. I set the budget within the context of the independent... Now, I could have just said, oh, I'll ignore the Office of Budget Responsibility. That's what Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did, and look at the impact of that. That crashed the economy. It sent interest rates soaring and put pensions in peril. I've always said I would never take risks with the public finances.
You said in a piece last Sunday, that we wouldn't be looking in the rear-view mirror. You've already mentioned Tories twice in this interview. You mentioned them 26 times in your budget. So let's just leave the Tories to one side for a moment. Can we come to your point about the OBR? You said... you want to be honest. When you spoke to the country on November the 4th, you warned that we'd all have to contribute to filling this financial black hole. But you already knew at that moment that the OBR had assessed that your plans at that point, let's be clear, the plans that you'd given them at that point would deliver a surplus of £4 billion. Why did you lie to the country?
Well, first of all, that was pre any measures, as they've been very clear. But if I was on this programme today and I said, I've got a £4.2 billion surplus, you would have said, and rightly so, that is not enough, Chancellor. That would have been the lowest surplus.
Well, never mind what I would have said. Why didn't you say to the country, you know what, I've got 4 billion. I don't think it's enough. I want to do some other things. Why didn't you make it clear that the OBR had already told you you had the 4.4, a little bit more than £4 billion surplus on the plans that you had given them?
Right, the way that the OBR forecast works is that they do the forecast before any plan. So this was pre any measures. But the just over £4 billion surplus was not enough. I said in that speech that I wanted to achieve three things in the budget. Tackling the cost of living, which is why I took £150 off of energy bills and froze prescription charges and rail fares. I wanted to continue to cut NHS waiting lists, which is why I protected NHS spending, and that I wanted to bring the debt and the borrowing down, which is one of the reasons why I increased the headroom. £4 billion of headroom would not have been enough, and it would not give the Bank of England space to continue to cut interest rates. Just this week, Lloyds Banking Group, the biggest mortgage lender, have cut interest rates on their mortgages, giving much relief to homeowners and people getting new mortgages.
Yes.
I was clear that we needed to rebuild those public finances.
The reason you didn't tell us that you had, at that point, been advised you had the £4 billion before any measures was that you knew you wanted to do the things that you did do on welfare and reversing on the winter fuel allowance, which you knew about and so on. So essentially the point here is that you knew that you were going to want tax rises for decisions that you wanted to make on welfare. It wasn't something that was done to you. These were your choices, and that's why this issue is important. That at that point, you didn't say to the country, we're more or less in balance, but I am going to ask you for more taxes because I want to make a choice to spend more money on welfare, for example. Why didn't you say that at that time? What you said to us is, big black hole, it's terrible.
£4 billion is clearly not enough fiscal headroom. It would have been the lowest headroom.
And you made a choice.
Trevor,
you made a choice to double the fiscal headroom.
Yes,
but my point is, you made that choice.
Yes, I did.
And you didn't tell us at the point when you said, you warned us we were going to have to pay, that we were going to have to pay for choices that you were making now.
Yes, and I said in that speech that I wanted to reduce the debt and reduce borrowing. So I increased that fiscal headroom. I'm very happy.
You didn't tell us you were going to tax us more in order to give you an extra £10 billion fiscal headroom.
No, Trevor, that's just not true. In that speech...
No, you didn't say it. Where did you say that in that speech?
I said in that speech that I wanted to increase our resilience by increasing the headroom. I was very clear in that speech.
And welfare spending.
Well, one of the things I did in the budget was lift 450,000 children out of poverty. That was funded through cracking down on tax avoidance, more measures in the budget, and introducing a gambling tax. I always said that to reduce child poverty, it had to be fully costed and fully funded. So the gambling tax and cracking down on tax avoidance and evasion was used to reduce child poverty. That was the right thing to do. I'm very happy to defend my choices on the cost of living, reducing child poverty, reducing NHS waiting lists and building that financial resilience into our numbers.
Let me put this question to you in maybe a less aggressive way. Why can't you say, I'm a Labour Chancellor. I decided at that point I was going to ask for more taxes in order to do Labour things, which involves particularly raising the amount we spend on welfare. Why can't you just say that's what you decided to do?
Well, the three objectives I had in the budget were to cut the cost of living, which is why we gave £150 off of everyone's NHS bills and froze prescription charges and rail fares. I said in that speech at the beginning of November that I wanted to cut NHS waiting lists. Both of those are very Labour things to do. But also, I wanted to ensure that our economy was resilient to withstand shocks, like conflicts, like trade barriers. And that's why I wanted to increase the headroom. To do those things in the context of a downgrade in our productivity, which costs £16 billion, I needed to increase taxes. And I was honest and frank about that in the speech that I gave at the beginning of November. I've kept that contribution that everyone needs to make as low as possible through a number of progressive reforms.
You do keep mentioning...
Those are Labour choices.
You do keep mentioning the downgrade, but actually you knew at the time from the OBR that downgrade had been balanced by wage increases, tax revenues from wage increases
let me address that
and
head
inflation.
on. Let me address that head on, Trevor. The biggest single factor for the lower tax revenues is the productivity downgrade. But in addition to that, the OBR said before the measures that I took in the budget that inflation was going to be higher and that would result in higher tax receipts. But that's not a good thing because higher inflation, inflating tax revenues...
Nobody thinks it's a great thing.
No,
All I'm saying is...
What I'm saying is that...
You keep saying it...
Trevor, I wanted to address this, and it is really important that people understand this. Because of the measures that I took in the budget, inflation is going to be 0.4 percentage points lower next year than they originally forecast because of our cost of living measures to reduce inflation. And so I needed to address as well the higher inflation that the OBR said would otherwise result. So there were a number of things happening in the economy, lower productivity growth, but also higher inflation, and I needed to address both of those.
I wish we could talk in more detail about that, but no doubt we'll come back and talk about whether that's worked in inflation in a year's time. Now, but the leader of the opposition...
Let's see, but the OBR say 0.4 percentage points off of inflation, in part because of £150 off of energy bills.
It hasn't... OK. Look, the leader of the opposition said about the choices that you made that, I'm quoting here, for months, Reeves has lied to the public to justify record tax hikes to pay for more welfare. Did you lie?
Look, I'm a Labour Chancellor. I want to reduce child poverty. I make no apologies for that. This will be the biggest ever reduction in child poverty in a parliament ever. And I'm proud to be the Chancellor that lifts 500,000 kids out of poverty. That means kids not going to bed hungry. It means kids not waking up in cold and damp homes. And I am proud and I'm very happy to defend the choices I've made.
I just asked you, did you lie? And I have to say, the answer I was looking for was no.
No.
I didn't hear the word no.
But you also asked about welfare in that question.
No, I just asked you, did you lie?
Of course I didn't.
Good, OK. By the way, was the Prime Minister informed through all of this process?
Yes,
and he was right there with you on it all.
Yes, of course.
Decisions you made, what you said on November the 4th.
Yes, we are a partnership. We have a budget board. The Prime Minister, Keir, and myself met regularly to discuss the budget and the choices, because these are the choices of this government. And I'm really proud of the choices that we made to cut waiting lists, to cut inflation, and to build up that resilience in our economy.
OK, let's get off process and talk about the actual central choice that you made, which is the decision to lift the two-child benefit cap. Extra £3,500 every household on universal credit with a third child. Why should a working woman who has restricted the size of her own family to 2 children or fewer subsidise a woman who has made a different choice?
Well, first of all, it is men and women who decide to have children, and the choice
benefits go to the mother. For children, anyway.
They go to the main carer. Yeah. That is predominantly women.
But you know the question I'm asking you. Why should that woman subsidise a woman who's made another choice?
I really would prefer you to talk about families. But, OK, so what the two-child limit did was push children into poverty. More than 300,000 children were pushed into poverty because of this choice, and 450,000 children will be taken out of poverty. And I think, and I'm a mum with 2 children, I am very happy to support children from poorer backgrounds live more fulfilling lives. In fact, when I became Chancellor, I said that I knew that my time as Chancellor would have been a success if there are ordinary children from working-class backgrounds living more fulfilling lives. And I think it is very difficult to live a fulfilling life when you're growing up in poverty. We've got children stuck in bed and breakfast accommodation because their parents can't afford the rent. We've got kids going to school hungry because parents are making choices between heating the home and putting food on the table. We've got children going to school with coats that don't fit, that shoes don't fit, with shoes with holes in it. And I've seen it myself in my own constituency and around the country. And I am not willing to just stand by knowing that there's something that I can do about it as Chancellor. And that's why we made that choice to lift 500,000 kids out of poverty. And if I do nothing else during the course of this Parliament that ensure that kids don't grow up hungry, then I'm really pleased.
By the way, last time I asked you that
Chancellor.
question, you didn't say any of that. You said we couldn't afford it.
And what I set out in the budget is how it is fully costed and fully funded. So we introduced an increase in the online gambling taxes. So online gaming, the taxes goes up to 40%.
Yes.
Online betting, the taxes go up to 25%. That brings in more than £1 billion a year. Well, Trevor...
I get the political argument.
No,
we don't ring-fence gambling taxes to pay for this.
No,
I mean, honestly.
Well, actually, what you need to do if you introduce a policy is explain where the money's going to come from. And I have done that. We're cracking down on tax avoidance. In fact, we're going to raise £10 billion extra a year through cracking down on tax avoidance. And we are introducing these taxes on online gambling.
It came from freezing tax thresholds.
Well,
but look, you still haven't answered... You haven't answered the moral question I've asked you, which is the question that your constituents will ask. Because you talk about as though actually children just arrive by accident. People make a choice. Are the 560,000 households who are going to benefit from this change, are they all people who had no choice about whether they had the third or fourth child?
Well, in my constituency of Leeds West and Pudsey, around a third of kids grow up in poverty. And you asked about my constituency.
Was the people make a choice. And my question, which you still haven't answered, is what do you say to the person who says, I made this choice, why should I subsidise somebody who made a different choice?
Because all children should live fulfilling lives, and it is the children in the end that pay the price of poverty. But let me say something else about choice. Because under the two-child cap that the Conservatives introduced, there was something called the rape clause. So if you... a rape clause, which meant that if you conceived non-consensually, you could still get support if you could prove that your child was born non-consensually. Well, as the first female Chancellor of the Exchequer, I'm not willing to preside over a system where a woman has to prove that. And so along with getting rid of that two-child cap, we've also got rid of that rape clause. And I think every single woman in this country, to come back to your first question, would be very pleased to hear that.
I would freely acknowledge, I have a view about it, that what you've just said was a scandal. But it had very little to do with the actual choice you've made. Let me put it this to you.
You can't have a limit that doesn't involve something like that, because unless you said that a child that was born non-consensually didn't deserve support. So any system
there are not
that
560,000 children who are the result of that situation.
No,
I mean,
there's
come
not.
on.
But that clause will exist as long as you cap the number of children that get support. But in the end, it is children that pay the price of this vicious and cruel policy, and that will end in April next year.
Let me just put it to you that there may be another reason here. This policy has been discussed many times. Here's what the public thinks. 37% of Labour voters in 2020, those who voted Labour in 2024, are in favour of scrapping the cap. More than half of Labour voters are not in favour of it. Who is in favour of it are Labour Party members, 84% of them. Are you choosing party over country here?
I'm choosing children, Trevor. This lifts more than 500,000 children out of poverty. Combined with our changes on free breakfast clubs, extending free school meals, 30 hours free childcare for working parents with preschool-age children. You can put up those percentages, but the people I was thinking about were kids who I know in my constituency who go to school hungry and go to bed in cold and damp homes. And from April next year, those parents will have a bit more support to help their kids.
One other issue that came out of the budget, of course, the big thing was the stealth taxes. Now, I chair a medium-sized business myself. We've done pretty well. We want to expand. I know what's going to happen this week. Chief Financial Officer is going to say, rise in national insurance, massive hike in business rates. They've already added tens of thousands to our overheads. The CHRO is going to warn that the stealth taxes, the freezing of the thresholds, have just pushed up the cost of hiring because candidates know that they're going to get less out of their pay packets because more is going to HMRC. Your big priority is supposed to be growth. You're actually killing growth.
The freezing the thresholds that I announced come in 2028, so there would be no change before that point. Of course, the previous government froze thresholds for 7 years.
We didn't know that you were going to extend them for another 3 years.
Well, I did say in that speech at the beginning of November that we would have to ask people to contribute more. Now, we didn't put up the tax rate and we didn't do anything in April next year. But yes, from 2028, we have thrown...
But bosses are already saying that they're going to slow hiring.
Well, if you look at some of the announcements...
Because of this.
Well, Trevor, if you look at some of the announcements that's come since I made the budget, the Co-op, the supermarket group, have said they're going to put £1 billion into cutting or freezing prices of 2,700 items in their shops. JP Morgan have announced the investment of a new office in London employing 12,000 people. Goldman Sachs are doubling the number of people that they are going to employ in Birmingham. So look at the announcements that we've had since that budget: more hiring, more jobs, lower prices.
One last question, if I may. I know you've given us generously more time than we should have. How did you feel about the Leader of the Opposition's response to you, including her mocking and mimicking you, and then she put it, talking to you woman to woman?
There was a leak of the budget document 45 minutes before I stood up to deliver my speech. One of my worries is that the opposition had all that time to go through all of the documents, something which you do not usually have the luxury of, and I've had to respond to a budget before as Shadow Chancellor. And so I was concerned that there would be a forensic analysis on the floor, which you wouldn't usually have. But there wasn't any of that. There wasn't an economic argument in Kemi Badenoch's response to my budget. And so if she wants to resort to personal attacks, that's fine, that's her choice. But I want to focus on the issues, cutting the cost of living, cutting NHS waiting lists and cutting the debt and borrowing. OK, last question. You talked about the OBR.
Is it time for the chair of the OBR to go?
Look, there is no one who's a bigger supporter of the Office of Budget Responsibility than me. I reappointed Richard Hughes in the summer. We've strengthened the powers of the OBR. We will get a report tomorrow, the report that looks at what happens about that budget leak. It was clearly serious. It was clearly a serious breach of protocol.
But he's safe.
But I'll see that report tomorrow.
But his position's safe.
Well, I'll see that report tomorrow. But I've got a huge amount of respect both for Richard and for the Office of Budget Responsibility. But look, I'll get that report tomorrow now.
Chancellor, thank you so much for... You gave us extra time, and I appreciate it.
A pleasure.
Well, let's see what our panel made of all that. The former Financial Times editor, Lionel Barber. The former EU Foreign Affairs High Representative, Baroness Cathy Ashton. And the chair of Woburn Partners and former Sky News presenter, Jeff Randall. Lionel, let's just deal with the process issue first, the OBR thing. Were you persuaded by the Chancellor's explanation?
No, I wasn't, and I'll say why shortly, but it's patently obvious, Trevor, that the budget process is utterly broken, that the relationship between the Treasury and the Office of Budget Responsibility, created, by the way, by George Osborne 15 years ago, is also broken. And I'll explain why. The Chancellor has been forced into a difficult position because she knows that the OBR has multiple forecasts. It's got something to say about productivity. It then had another go in terms of wages and inflation, which affects the fiscal position. But the Chancellor has produced endless leaks. She's gone public with a proposal to, well, hinted at income tax increases. All this sends a completely confused message. And in the background is this constant refrain that there's not much we can do, Gov, because it's all the last lot's problem, that we inherited a total mess. So when you then see the leak from the OBR, it was unintended apparently, We'll hear about that tomorrow. That sort of sums up the chaotic process. We can talk about the choices. I think some of them were bad. You come on that. But my main point here is that the whole budget process needs to be rethought.
Cathy, what did you think of the Chancellor's defence of the relationship with the OBR in this particular case?
Well, I think it's incredibly important that in anything that the Chancellor or the OBR do, that there's a sense of what the direction is that we're trying to go in. And I always look through the lens of not so much the nitty-gritty process side of this, but much more through the lens of, is there a story that we can tell about what the end result will be of the actions that are taken? You know, the question of who said who, what to whom and so on is interesting and it's relevant, and I don't try and deny that, but I'm much more interested in what it is we're trying to do at the end of it.
Well, are you getting any sense of what that story might be?
I think we are lacking a bit the vision thing, as I call it, which is that in order for people to go along with sometimes tough and difficult measures, whether that's individuals, whether that's businesses, whether that's the society as a whole, you can only achieve that if people think at the end of it, there is something that's going to be of benefit to them, their families, their communities, their businesses and so on.
Jeff, what did you
I struggle with that.
Forgive me. Jeff, what do you make of it?
Well, Trevor, I think you went after her on exactly the right topic, and that is honesty. And I think the Chancellor has a probity problem here. If you look back over the last 18 months, 2 years, what have we seen? First of all, she published a book on women in economics, and thanks to great work by Lionel's old team at the FT, we know that book was riddled with plagiarisms, at least 20 examples of work taken without attribution. Then we had her CV claims that she was an economist at the Bank of Scotland. Now, the joke is in the city that she was really Rachel from accounts. Well, she wasn't even that. She was Rachel from customer complaints.
We don't want to go too far over her CV, Jeff.
Okay,
let's deal with what she said today.
Let me just make this point, because we get down to, do we now trust her? Do we now believe her after a series of, shall we say, unfortunate errors on her part? And I think the answer is no. I think she lacks probity. I think the public perceives that. Her rating, in terms of the job she's doing, is attracting a dissatisfaction rate of 71%. It's the worst on record since polling began. The public no longer believes us. So when we're getting down to the OBR, which was your question, I think the public is more likely to believe Richard Hughes of the OBR than the Chancellor.
The problem is that Rachel Reeves made some very poor choices in her first budget. She didn't leave herself enough fiscal headroom. She should have looked at the state of public finances and said, if things are so serious as they are, then we need to break the manifesto commitment and increase taxes. Now, she had a similar opportunity this year to say, we have very little headroom. We must take a decisive measure. And she floated this. I know she didn't say it exactly, to say we may have to raise income tax. That was allowed to play out in the markets. And then she did a retreat. So she looks as though she's a hapless figure being tossed around by events. And then you nailed her. You said, well, actually, you've used the extra money that you had under the mattress because you just wanted to splurge on welfare spending. So she's not being straight.
Not exactly my words, but basically...
Well, I was paraphrasing, as I often do.
I just think we've got to be a bit careful about, Jeff, what I think of as sort of a little bit of a cheap shot stuff. Because I think what we need to focus on is what this budget actually means for people.
I want to ask about that, Cathy, because the centrepiece of the budget was the decision, essentially, to lift the two-child benefit cap. And this, in a way, I think the Prime Minister and the Chancellor advanced as an expression of what they're about, in a sense, the story that you talked about. Were you convinced that this was the best way to do it?
Well, I'm one of the people who was fortunate in life to have been a Sure Start minister. And I'm a huge fan of the work that was done in the Blaze as it happened, but that's neither here nor there, to be able to work at how you lift children out of poverty in the broader sense of the word poverty. Because as the Chancellor rightly talked about, it's about more than just the obvious. It's more than just have they got enough food, it's more than just what they've got to wear and where you live and all of those things, which are incredibly important. But it's also about the ability to be able to access the kind of future that we want all these children to have. Whether they're the third child or the fourth child or the second child, this is about the future of our society. These people will contribute. So I think I would probably have wanted to do more to try and recreate what was the most successful programme on poverty for children. What was something that was so successful, middle-class parents wanted to get their kids into Sure Start programmes, and which we know from the results that we saw with 11-year-olds was hugely successful.
So if you had the $3 billion, you would have put it into Sure Start rather than into this?
I would have wanted to look at that as an option, for sure, because you make choices in what you think is going to be the best way forward. And it's not about saying to parents, you shouldn't have the ability to make choices for your kids. But if you've got those kind of programmes that you know work and that can show you can give children a really good start in life, why not recreate them?
Jeff, I did put it to the Chancellor that more widely there would be a question in people's minds about whether this was morally justified, if I can put it this way. And David Blunkett, the former Labour Cabinet Minister, said this week that actually he would have chosen Sure Start rather than this, and partly because people think that, other people make a different choice. Do you think that the Chancellor's response to this was convincing?
Well, let me just answer Kathy. Kathy, I thought it was surprising that you said I was making a cheap shot.
Yeah.
Looking at the Chancellor's integrity. I think that's precisely what MPs will be looking at tomorrow in Parliament. But let's move on to the question about the cap, or the removal of the cap. You asked that question last week, Trevor, or was it the week before, to Heidi Alexander. You didn't get a response, but you had a good go.
I'm glad somebody's watching.
The nub of your question was, is it fair? Is it fair? Because the Chancellor and indeed the Prime Minister bang on about fairness. And this is the fundamental point with this. Is it fair that a couple who perhaps both work on low wages, near to minimum wage, do their best, work hard, try to save, and make that choice after child number 2, not to have any more? They would like to, but they don't because they can't afford it. On the other side of the fence, we now have a group of people who are on welfare benefits who are able to have as many children as they like. In fact, there's an old iron law in economics that if you subsidise something, you get more of it. And I fear that we are going to encourage a lot of benefits families simply to have more children because it suits them. And here's I can see Kathy shaking her head. Here's the thing. If they then have more children, let's say have 4 or 5, and they are relying on benefits, to get back into work becomes very, very difficult if they are going to enter the work way down the pay scales.
Trevor, the big story this week is what did the Chancellor know and when did she say it? What were the interactions between the Treasury and the Office of Budget Responsibility? I think this is really, really important because it does bear on probity and honesty. But the Chancellor felt boxed in by the Office of Budget Responsibility saying, you've got a big productivity downgrade. And she responded by saying, well, actually, it's an emergency. Then when it eased off with another communication from the OBR, she then decided, well, I've got the headroom, I'm going to spend. So I understand why the Chancellor feels that the OBR role here is very important. But what you discovered today and what's going to be a big story this week is actually she knew she had the headroom and she decided to go spend. And that wasn't the message early in November.
We will return to talking about the other leg of this budget, which is the growth question, businesses and jobs and so on. I think that's equally important. But the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, was on fighting form in response to that budget, with a savage attack on Rachel Reeves in the Commons. She's now calling the Chancellor a liar. I spoke to the Conservative leader a little earlier. Kemi Badenoch, the reviews for your budget response were pretty much all 5-star. I'm going to come to the content in a moment, but this sounded much more like the Kemi Badenoch we first met when you ran for the leadership. Why is it taking over a year for that person to re-emerge?
Well, I didn't have a budget to respond to when I first became leader, so we can start by looking at how much has happened certainly since Conservatives lost the election. My job is to be leader of the opposition, and it's becoming clearer and clearer what this government is about. And it's not about me, it's about the people out there who I'm speaking for. And I get more passionate when I remember all the people that I've met throughout the year who are suffering, who say that they can't go on anymore, that they're working harder and harder, getting poorer and poorer, and think the government doesn't know what it's doing. Someone has to speak up for them, and that's my job.
Well, actually, let's talk about the way you speak up for them. There was a new element here, which I hadn't heard before. You mocked the Chancellor, you mimicked her. Is that the way we do politics now? Wasn't that a bit personal?
I don't think so. I think the Chancellor has been doing a terrible job. She's made a mess of the economy, and you look at the papers today, she has told lies. This is a woman who, in my view, should be resigning. Tone policing, how I hold her to account, I think is by the by. Did she do those things or did she not? Is she doing a good job? And she's the one who's actually made it personal, talking about how all of this is happening because she's a woman. Completely ridiculous.
Just so you know, she did say that she heard that, and she definitely didn't lie. But what she said about you was that because of the early leak, you had the chance to study all the detail and to deal with the content of her budget and address the economic arguments, but that you chose not to do that and concentrate on personalities.
Nonsense. I gave a 20-minute speech where I had quite a lot of economic arguments to make, especially that she is borrowing so much, leaving debt to our children, all to pay benefits. That is not fair on the working people of this country. And she can complain as much as she likes. In her first budget, when I wasn't even the leader, Rachel Reeves took some time out to take a swipe at me. She can dish it, but she can't take it. And that's the story about Labour. They think that they have a right to go after everybody else because they think they're better than everybody else. They are not. They need to be held to the same standards as everybody else. And right now, they are failing to meet those standards. She's not doing a good job. She's not.
OK, let's talk about the substance. You attacked the Chancellor's decision to lift the two-child benefit cap. Is there some particular reason that you want 450,000 to grow up in children to grow up in poverty?
Not at all. I want them to grow up to live healthy, wealthy lives. But this is not the way to...
Well, why don't you support the lifting of the two-child benefit cap? Everybody else does.
No, that's not true, actually, because this is not the way to do it. What we are doing is taxing a lot of people who are struggling to pay for those on benefits. About 500,000 families are going to be getting an uptake of about £5,000. Many other people don't have £5,000 lying around. We believe that people on benefits should have to make the same decisions about having children as everybody else. And remember, we're not talking about child benefit here. We're talking about the universal credit element of it. You get child benefit for as many children as you have. But at some point, someone needs to draw a line somewhere.
Indeed. But let's deal with the fact here. Of those who are going to get, that's 560,000 households, those who are going to get some extra because they've got more than 2 children, 70% of them are in work. 60% of people on universal credit who get the benefit are in work. This is not supporting shirkers. This is backing strivers.
If we want to make sure that children don't grow up in poverty, we need to make sure that their parents have jobs and that those jobs pay well.
But the point is, lots of them are in jobs, but they are also very poor.
I haven't finished answering your last question. Under Labour, unemployment has gone up every single month since they came into office, every single month. 1 million more people are now on out-of-work benefits than when they came into office. 5,000 new people each day claiming health and sickness benefits. Who is paying for all this? A smaller and smaller group of people. What we need is growth in our economy. Simply taking out from people who are struggling and giving to a different group of people is not making the economy better. And in fact, the OBR says household incomes across the board are going to go down. We are getting poorer.
But you're still
We're
not
getting poorer.
You're still not answering my question.
I have
Which
answered.
is that of the people who will get this benefit, the vast majority are workers, but they are very poor workers. And you're saying, actually, bad luck.
No, what I'm saying is we need to grow our
It's
economy.
a bit Victorian,
This
though.
is this
Yeah,
is we're
that'll
making,
happen,
Yes,
but what
we're
about those people
No, it
now?
won't happen. It won't happen, Trevor. That is the problem. We are getting poorer. Simply saying, oh well, the growth will come from somewhere. From where? Every single thing that Rachel Reeves did in that budget makes all of us poorer. There are a lot of people out there who are struggling. Go and look at the farmers, for instance. We're taxing farmers, many of whom are getting less than the minimum wage to pay for benefits. We are taxing everybody now to pay for benefits. This was a budget for benefits. That is not the Chancellor's job. That is not what she's supposed to be doing. Benefits are supposed to be a safety net. They're not supposed to make you middle class. We are at a point now where the rider is getting heavier than the horse. We cannot afford this, and we are leaving debts for our children. That is not fair.
A lot of farmers and farm workers are very poor people. They would qualify for this benefit.
No, actually, because of what's going to happen, many of them are being forced to sell their farms. We're forcing people to sell farms and then putting them on benefits. It just doesn't make any sense.
Let me ask you the question. A lot of them will be poor. A lot of them, whatever they do, will qualify for this benefit. Is it morally right for the state to treat their third child differently from their second child?
This is not what the state is meant to be doing. Farmers out there aren't asking. They're not asking for more benefits.
What the state does do.
They're asking to stop being taxed so heavily.
But it is what the state does do.
Maybe if the state stopped taxing everybody so much, there would be more money for that third child. I have 3 children.
Oh, so you would do it if we had the money?
No, this is about making sure that we can live within our means. The government is not living within its means. It's squeezing more and more people. That is the budget that Rachel Reeves has given out. And she has done it off the backs of a lot of people who are struggling.
All right.
Right now, we give child benefits to as many children as you have. But this universal credit element, we have to draw a line somewhere. If you can make that argument and say, well, why stop at the third child? Why not the fourth? Why not the fifth? Why not the sixth?
Well, why not?
Because
all children are equally valuable in any family.
Because this is not about the value of children. This is about government making sure that we live within our means. The government's job is to draw a line where it is responsible. The responsible place is to have a 2-child benefit cap on the element of universal credit.
So actually, this is purely about money rather than about morality.
This is about making sure that we do not keep creating debt for our children. It is immoral, Trevor, if you want to talk about morality, it is immoral to saddle the next generation and children who are not yet born with debt so that people alive today can be a little bit more comfortable.
All right, so if you came in, you would reverse
yes,
this
we would. We would put that cap back. Somebody has to draw the line somewhere. And we are the only party saying this. Labour, Lib Dems, Reform, SNP, Green, Plaid, they all want more benefits. Only the Conservatives are saying this is getting out of hand.
You said this morning in a national newspaper that you'd make £23 billion worth of annual savings in the welfare bill. OK, £3 million from reversing the decision on a 2-child cap. Where's the other £20 billion coming from?
By changing the way that we carry out workplace assessments, by making sure that we stop giving welfare for low-level conditions. People are claiming benefits for tennis elbow. We had an extraordinary case, DWP said people are getting mobility cards for tennis elbow, anxiety, ADHD. A lot of people with those conditions.
But you and I know that the big rise is in mental health conditions. So what you're saying is...
Trevor, if I may continue, these are low-level mental health conditions. Many of these people would have been in work a few years ago. They are finding ways to stay out of work. Work would help them. It would give them dignity.
You think they're lollygagging? You think they're just staying at home and using mental health as an excuse?
How is it possible that a year ago, 2,000 new people each day were claiming benefits, and now it's 5,000 new people each day claiming health and sickness benefits? We see online influencers...
So all
Trevor,
these people...
I've got to be able to finish a sentence.
We're talking about
online, we
thousands.
see
They're just making it up that they are
we actually
in trouble.
see online people saying, this is what you do, this is how you make the claim. You pick up the phone, you tell them you're too anxious to come in. People are gaming the system. But there are other things we said we will do. By restricting benefits to UK nationals, the system is out of control when it comes to giving welfare benefits. Too many people are on it. We need to get them into work. That's what's going to grow the economy. That'll get Britain working again.
One thing you must have been pleased by this week is the fall in net migration numbers, and I'm sure that you'll claim some of the credit for that.
Yes, we do. Yes. There were changes that were made before July 2024.
But you also welcome the statement by the newish Home Secretary. Do you think she's going far enough?
I don't think she's going far enough, but what she is doing is right. There's some of the things that I don't agree with, but she seems to be the only person in the Labour Party who gets that we need to control our borders. So I will support her because I can see that she's getting a lot of stick, not just from her own backbenchers, but parties like the Lib Dems and the SNP and the Greens.
Well, I'm sure that endorsement will have completely killed her leadership ambitions, but let me just deal with one other element of this. Government said it's learning from Denmark, but I wonder if you think it's learning the right lessons. The Danes, for example, won't provide accommodation for asylum seekers in areas where they think there is too much of a concentration of people from a particular background, what they call parallel communities. But of course, joining a community where people speak your language and so on is one of the pull factors here in the UK. If you're in government, would you support the Danish approach?
I think that there are many lessons that we can learn from Denmark. I'm not 100% familiar with exactly what and why they have done certain things, but like a lot of European countries who have the same problems we do on controlling borders, they recognise that the way we used to do things 20, 50 years ago doesn't work in a world of social media, mobile phones, where people can isolate themselves. I definitely agree that we should not be encouraging people to join parallel communities. People who come to our country need to be contributing to it. They need to be net contributors. And they also need to want to be British. I don't want lots of people coming here, creating new communities representing what they had back home. If you want to be, living in a Pakistani community or a Nigerian community or Iraqi community, then go to those countries. You come here, be British. That's what it's about.
Kemi Badenoch, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Trevor.
Back to our panel, Lionel, Kathy and Jeff. Lionel, Kemi Badenoch found her voice.
I think she has. There we are. You heard it first. Because she's got a story that Britain's living off Benefit Street, and this is a Labour government that isn't thinking hard enough about how to create the conditions for growth. It's just spending, and it's spending in the wrong areas. And for those who say, as we do in America, all politics is local, for her, it's all politics is personal.
Kathy, you might not like what she's saying, but it's clear now, isn't it? Or clearer.
Yeah, I think there's no question that what you had was somebody with a more polished performance. The question, though, is whether there's any delivery under the performance, isn't it?
That's it, is it?
That's it.
Let's return to the actual substance. Let's talk economics, if we may. Let's have a look at one signal of what growth might look like, because that's the central thing that the government's banging on about. Household disposable income, and we've seen it from 1979, last half century, forecast for the current parliament down household disposable income down below 0.5% rise over the entire parliament. That's growth. Jeff, what do you make of it?
Well, there's a lot to chew on here, but if we go back to the first budget of Rachel Reeves, she had two big goals in mind: growth and jobs. And to some extent, disposable income is a product of those two elements. How has she done on growth and jobs? Well, growth tepid at best. The economy shrank in September. OBR has just downgraded its forecast for the next 5 years. We're going to be growing at something like 1.5% a year. That doesn't blow the doors off. Unemployment has risen every month since Rachel Reeves' first budget. And that's not surprising because she whacked on a national insurance tax or a higher tax and that's a tax on jobs. So jobs are under pressure, growth is under pressure. What's not under pressure is taxation. She's pushing it up. So it's hardly surprising that disposable incomes are going to be squeezed.
I just carry on, but I can show you where we are on tax raising, I think. This looks like it's going to be the most tax-raising parliament in recent history. It goes from 1970 to 74, where taxes at the end of the parliament were a bit lower, right to now, highest in my adult lifetime.
Yeah. Look, let's try and be fair to Rachel Reeves just for a moment. I mean, we are living off the legacy of the global financial crisis, which really damaged the City of London as a producer of revenues. Yep. We had the COVID pandemic, where the government decided, it was a Conservative government, to come in with the furlough schemes, billions spent. Remember, the necessary supports for the public at that point. But you now have a situation, as you've identified, where the government is taking increasing amounts in taxation. And even though, by the way, Rachel Reeves, I think necessarily is not, at this moment, Jeff talked about tepid growth, to whack income tax at this point in the cycle would be dangerous for consumption and economic growth. So she has put it for the end of Parliament, where tax comes in. But the overall picture, Trevor, is there's not enough understanding of economic incentives. There's no understanding of the message this sends to foreign investors. It's really negative. We're in a very tight spot here.
We've got to go to break in a second, but just quickly, Kathy, what people are saying this weekend is what we're seeing is a return. It's being posed as a return to tax and spend Labour. I guess that the Cabinet would say, you call it tax and spend, but this is what Labour is here to do. Taking Lionel's cue, are we being a little unfair to Rachel Reeves by not interpreting what she's doing as what Labour governments do?
Yeah, I think it's just a bit simplistic, really. That I think from everything we know about the situation that was inherited, and I'm not going to go back over all that, but I would raise two particular issues where growth could be found. I sit on two committees in the House of Lords. I've just chaired an inquiry into space. Very few people know that the biggest place where you build satellites in Europe is actually in Scotland. Very few people know that the potential growth from investment in space for farming, for transport, for engineering is enormous. But we're not looking at growth strategies in the same way. The other committee that I sit on, is Europe. And we still have not addressed the question of our relationship with Europe.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the situation in Ukraine now. President Zelensky is under huge pressure over his closest ally and chief of staff stepping down following a corruption scandal in his office, while a Ukrainian delegation is now in the United States for more talks over a proposed US peace deal. Let's discuss that with Lionel and Kathy and Jeff. Kathy, let's just start, if we may, with what we are hearing from Ukraine. And the headline appears to be that Zelensky's position, the position of Zelensky himself, is steadily being weakened. And of course, that has implications for what he can deliver.
I mean, he's got a really difficult situation. It's day 1376, I think, of the war, that Ukraine is being bombarded with, particularly in ways that will affect power and energy and light for people in this difficult winter. There's an exhausted population, and he's trying to manage a situation where President Trump and his team seem to be more interested in the relationship with Moscow and this sense of these three great leaders, Xi Jinping, President Trump, and of course President Putin, rather than supporting the sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine. And he's managing that with a big group of the coalition of the willing, made up of largely European plus other nations that are trying to help him. but are years behind in terms of the practical things that they can offer. So it's not surprising, really, that he's finding himself in a position that's weaker, against a backdrop that corruption is still rife in Ukraine. It's still a problem. We see it writ large in what's happened this week with the departure of his closest ally and friend, and the consequences for that for him personally.
Cathy, I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on this point about the Europeans, because there is a belief, I suppose, in some people that if the Americans go soft, then Europe should and could step in.
Well, the challenge for Europe is it doesn't have the hardware to be able to do that. That at the moment it buys most of its stuff from the US. There are other markets it can use, and of course it's trying to build up its own industrial capacity. But it takes time. And it's also very difficult for businesses to be able to say, well, we're willing to step into the gap. We will invest in making things for a war that everyone in one sense is trying to end. Because you need, as a business, to invest whatever the product in something that's going to have a long-term or a longevity that is more than going to be potentially weeks or months. So the more that you have talk of peace, which is what we all want, and a way through that, the harder it is, in a sense, for Europe to be able to fulfil the hardware part of that equation. What matters most is that if we do get to a position of talks, which I hope we do, that when President Putin looks across the table at Ukraine, he just doesn't see Ukraine on its own. What he sees is who's sitting behind him and the strength and certainty of the support and the security guarantees that are being offered to him. And every time that looks weaker, then we embolden President Putin to just carry on the war. His economy is not suffering the way we want it to yet. The American sanctions could make a bigger impact on that, maybe $80 billion worth. You have got a population in Russia that is losing its children, its brothers, its sisters, its family members, that will grow tired of that and weary of that. But he doesn't have yet the sense of having to find a way through it. And while he has President Trump, he has, to a large extent, somebody who understands his agenda and is willing to play with that agenda.
Lionel, you're on planes all the time between here and the United States. One thing you can always be sure about Donald Trump is that he will scent weakness and opportunity.
He really has spotted that there is this corruption scandal that is eating up Zelensky's strength at home. And the crucial point, though, it's not just that. It's that Trump thinks that business beats everything, that this is essentially a real estate deal that can be done to forge a peace, that actually business, American business, can profit from a ceasefire/peace deal. The Wall Street Journal, I would commend, has got a terrific story at the weekend which identifies business lobbyists close to the administration, close to Steve Witkoff, the chief envoy, this is a great opportunity for us in the Arctic, in Siberia. So he's looking at that. He's not looking at this wider security picture. He's sidelined the key Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who's close to the Europeans, who was able to initially bring the European voice to the table. Actually, the Europeans are completely sidelined at the moment. Last point, there was a very big opportunity for the Europeans to seize the assets, the $300 billion which are frozen. That got blocked by the Belgians. It's not going to happen. So the money that they were going to use to lend to Ukraine to keep them going, it's blocked, it's still frozen.
Jeff, I want to come back to you, Kath, and just ask you briefly at the end what you think the prospects of a deal are. But Jeff, what do you make of it?
Two things, really, Trevor. I think we're talking about Trump and how he's dealing with Zelensky and Putin and his opportunities on the world stage, but he also has to bear in mind his own constituency back home, his own voters. What are they making of this? Now, President Trump claims that America has tipped $300 billion into Ukraine so far. Other, let's say, more reliable sources say 180 billion. We'll take that number, 180 billion. You know, that buys a lot of welfare programs in poor states in the United States. And selling this underpinning, this financial underpinning of Ukraine to the American voter is becoming increasingly difficult.
Not to mention selling it to MAGA.
Yes.
His own movement.
And if I can just bring that back to Britain, I mean, you talked about the Europeans stepping into the gap should the Americans go soft, as you put it. I don't know the expenditure of the European countries, but I do know that the UK, according to government information, has so far spent 22 billion in Ukraine on armaments, on financial support, on humanitarian aid, 22 billion. This is at a time when the Chancellor has just put the thumbscrews on the taxpayer for 26 billion, an extra 26 billion. I wonder how many people in this country still support us tipping money into Ukraine.
OK, Cathy, just quickly, we've got to go to a break, but just quickly, what do you think? Prospects for a deal?
It's possible that with the new 19-point plan that was hammered out in Geneva that you've got the beginnings of a deal. But, you know, it's very, very early in the process. And what they're going to have to do is work out the feasibility of providing an agreement that both sides are going to be able to walk away from and say, this is enough, it's good enough. And that's incredibly challenging. The
Liberal Democrats are no fans of Rachel Reeves's budget, it seems, accusing the government of launching a stealth tax assault. Well, I'm joined now by the party's deputy leader, Daisy Cooper. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm guessing, actually, that you liked some of the budget. Would I be right in thinking that you liked the lifting of the two-child benefit cap, but you didn't like the freezing of tax thresholds?
Correct. So we do support the lifting of the two-child benefit cap for two reasons. First of all, we think it is morally the right thing to do. And secondly, because it saves money for the taxpayer in the longer term, because we know that children growing up in poverty end up costing the taxpayer more because they have worse health outcomes, worse educational outcomes as well. We support the government's attempts to increase taxes on the remote gaming companies, for example. So those are good things that we do like, but we are deeply concerned about this double whammy stealth tax on both households and on high streets.
I want to come to all of that, but this is unusual for Liberal Democrats. You guys all have an eye to popular policies, and lifting the cap is a pretty unpopular policy because people say you have a choice these days about how many children you have, and why should we subsidise when we have decided to have only 2 children? Why should we subsidise people who want to have more?
Honestly, I think politicians have not gone out and sold the argument on this one. The fact is that if you don't subsidise them, to use that word, when they're growing up as children, we end up subsidising them lifelong. And so you can save money in the public purse. If you invest in children when they're young, they get better health outcomes, better educational outcomes. They're less likely to be unemployed as adults. So if we want to tackle the welfare bill, which is projected to grow and grow and grow, one of the best ways of doing that is to invest early on so you save later on.
Let me put to you something that Cathy Ashton, who's on the panel today and who was a Labour minister, said, which is that when she was in government, the money, what they put money into was Sure Start. Mm-hmm. And there are many people, including David Blunkett, former cabinet minister, who've been saying this week that actually if you had $3 billion to spend, that is a more effective way of using it, rather than giving £3,500 pounds to people who may or may not use it well, may or may not use it to support their children.
But there are lots of different ways in which you could spend this money. Of course there are. So there are different interventions. We can have that argument. But there's absolutely no doubt that the vast majority of child poverty charities have said, if you want to do this instantly, if you want to have an instant impact, this is the fastest way of having an instant impact on child poverty today.
All right, one item I wasn't sure you would like in the budget is the council tax surcharge on homes over 2 million. You for that or against it?
We're against it because it's just such a mess. Economists from left to right have said in the last few days, this is very complicated, it's a messy system, it won't come into effect for 3 years, and it's going to raise £400 million. If the Chancellor wants to go after wealth, we have said, why not raise a windfall tax on the big banks? You could raise £30 billion in the next 5 years. If you want to go after wealth, then why not reform capital gains tax in a more progressive, fairer way so the 0.1% super rich pay more? If the government is serious about going after wealth, they could raise a digital services tax on people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. All three of those measures would raise significantly more than 400 million from tweaking a system that could be ever so complicated. So I think the government needs to get its priorities straight.
Well, you have a priority of your own, which is to tax big business, and you've mentioned two kinds of big businesses. Big businesses, of which there are, by ONS definition, 8,000 or so, employ 11 million people in this country, 40% of the workforce, and they're going to be saying tomorrow morning to each other that they need to slow hiring because national insurance hike, and now because of business rates. You're going to kill, if you were in government, you'd be killing growth, wouldn't you?
No, we absolutely wouldn't. We've been calling for measures that would boost growth. We have singled out particular businesses and particular sectors where we think they could pay more money. So for the big banks, for example, the windfall tax that we're calling for is not a tax on the profits they've made from lending any money. It's the money that they've made from doing nothing at all, from taking no risk at all because of a glitch in the quantitative easing process. When you look at the digital services tax, this is a tax that would be levied on these really, these billionaires, the richest man in the world. I don't think you can honestly say that these particular sectors could afford to pay more money.
You're not seriously saying Elon Musk is going to pay our welfare bill. The pensions alone knocking on 130, 140 billion. Even Elon Musk hasn't got that kind of money.
Look, when you add up all of these different measures that we're calling for, it does add up to billions of pounds. And also, we said you've got to grow the economy. We can't keep talking about just taxing or cutting. We have got to grow our way to prosperity. And the best way of doing that is getting a better deal with Europe, which even within the government's own red lines could bring in an extra £25 billion a year. OK, so rejoin the EU. Look, that's not on the cards right now. What is on the cards is getting a better deal with Europe. There's so much red tape affecting British businesses in this country right now. If the government got a better deal and got rid of 2 billion bits of paper that businesses have had to complete since the Brexit deal, we could improve growth. You could have British businesses exporting abroad. That would bring extra revenue into the public purse to pay for our public services. OK, last quick questions. How worried are you about the fact that Mr Zach Polanski is hogging the limelight as a sort of leftish receptacle for disillusioned Labour voters? Look, Zach is clearly a very charismatic guy, but when you look in the ballot box, we Liberal Democrats have been absolutely winning in so many of the by-elections recently, in many places where the Green vote has been going down. So we're pretty confident that where we are fighting hard, we are doing well. Back to our panel, Lionel, Cathy and Jeff. Cathy, Daisy Cooper's got the answer. Europe.
I'm not saying that Europe is all the answer, but unquestionably what the government's called a reset is really important in terms of looking for growth. This is not about rejoining the EU. It's not about trying to take the country in a direction that's going to raise all of these historical issues yet again, but it is about saying that there are better relationships to be had with our biggest trading partner that will make business life easier. And that's about things like the SPS deal and all the rest of it. What I'd like to see the government doing, and Nick Thomas-Symonds is leading this and driving this, and I think doing a great job, but further and faster, please.
But well, OK, let's go back to the budget. Lots to talk about in Europe, but on another occasion. Jeff, what are the businesses going to be saying what are the bosses going to be saying to their boards this week?
I think it depends on what size of business we're talking about here. If you're looking at the really big boys, the BPs and the Shells and the Unilevers and the HSBCs, they can ride out almost any budget difficulties. But if you're at the other end of the food chain, if you're a small business employing maybe 10 or 20 people, a bit like your business, Trevor, the finance directors will be looking at their numbers and saying, hang on a minute, this national insurance is really punitive. It's up to 15%. We're struggling to make the numbers work for us. I think we need to start losing some jobs. And that is what has happened. At the very least, they'll be thinking about a hiring freeze. The bit that was slipped out at the bottom end of the budget, as it were, under the cover of darkness, was the increase in business rates. Now, this has hit pubs and the hospitality sector bang between the eyes, and they weren't expecting it. She didn't really make a a point of pointing it out in the budget, and I think they feel really betrayed. And I really do believe that if this goes ahead, we'll be seeing a large number of marginal pubs in Britain closed.
This is because there's both a rise in rates, but there's also been a revaluation of these
Correct,
properties.
exactly that. Of course, and the revaluation is upwards.
This was the most introspective budget that I've seen in years. It was totally geared to Labour backbenchers, geared towards spending and welfare, not enough on economic incentives. If she'd been bold, she would have said, this is such a serious situation, a national emergency, what we inherited. We are going to go for a clean, clear increase in income taxes. And then, with that buffer, we'll actually do some baseball here. I know it's a bit discredited in Australia, but where we're going to actually...
baseball is not...
I know,
okay.
but okay, go back 6 months, Trevor, with the cricket. But we would have cut national insurance. We would have sent a signal to employers that we want people to be hired. And then the second thing they should have done is deal with energy costs. This net zero, it's just crippling business. Big picture, we are in a situation where we're paying more on our debt, on our borrowing, than France, which has no government. Our guilt... So Jeff was just saying earlier, and while we were talking about how we're paying huge amounts on our interest on our debt. If those gilts came down, then Rachel Reeves would have much more room. We shouldn't be in a situation where we're so badly off compared to the French.
We've just got a minute to go. Jeff, I put to her that some of the judgments were party before country. Maybe the fair thing to say is that businesses particularly feel uncertain because this looks like a government that basically gets kicked around by the loudest voices, greatest protests and so on.
Indeed, and that includes the so-called bond vigilantes, the people who buy Britain's debt. To Lionel's point, I think a false narrative has taken hold here that somehow the financial markets were very calm and reacted positively to the budget. This is nonsense. Britain is paying 4.5% on 10-year money. France, in the eyes of some people, an economic basket case, is paying 3.5% and Germany about 2.5%. This matters because every 1% difference costs the Treasury, UK Treasury, £17 billion a year.
Yeah, it's a rich basket case, by the way.
On that optimistic bombshell, that is it from us this week. I'll be back next Sunday, 08:30. Join us.